Alexander White had always been a man who thrived on control. Every moment of his life had been carefully designed and executed, like pieces on a chessboard moved with deliberate precision. His time was divided between meetings in glass towers, sealed contracts that spanned continents, and nights spent alone in penthouses that whispered luxury yet echoed emptiness. But on this night, inside one of the most exclusive restaurants in New York, he was about to experience something that would strip him of every illusion he had about control. The restaurant buzzed softly with hushed conversations and the delicate clinking of glasses. A grand chandelier hung above, casting golden light onto tables draped in white linen. Alexander sat at his usual corner table, a glass of aged wine cradled in his hand. He was alone, as always, his gaze distant as he watched the reflection of the chandelier dance on the surface of his drink. He told himself he liked these moments. They were peaceful, a brief respite from the relentless climb of his empire. But even as he told himself this, a faint aching gnawed at the edges of his composure, a quiet discontent he couldn't quite name. He swirled his glass slowly, preparing to finish his meal and return to the sanctuary of his penthouse, when something tugged at the edge of his awareness. A soft shuffle, light footsteps drawing closer, and then a small voice, clear and sure, spoke one word that pierced through his thoughts like a dagger. "Daddy." The glass in his hand stopped mid-sway. He slowly turned his head, his body tensing in reaction. Standing beside him were two small girls, identical in every way. Their hair was long and golden, loosely pinned back by white berets that gleamed under the ambient light. Their dresses were simple, white t-shirts paired with denim skirts, and they wore sneakers that looked scuffed from play. But it was their eyes that stunned him the most, clear, unwavering, and locked onto his with a familiarity that unsettled him. For one long moment, Alexander couldn't breathe. He blinked, certain his mind was playing tricks on him. Perhaps he had worked too much, slept too little. He set the glass down with meticulous care and tried to find his voice, the composure he was so well known for. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, the calmness of his tone belied by the tightness in his chest. "What did you just say?" The braver of the two girls, the one who had spoken first, stepped forward, her tiny hands clenched into small fists at her sides, her chin lifted with a courage that made his throat tighten. "You're our daddy," she repeated softly. The words made something in him shift, like the cracking of ice on a frozen lake. He stared at them, searching their faces for answers. He didn't have children. He couldn't have children. That had been a fact he had accepted a long time ago, something buried beneath the ambitions that had shaped his life. Yet these girls were standing here, not just calling him their father, but believing it with everything they had. He tried to breathe evenly, but his pulse roared in his ears. Before he could react further, an older woman appeared behind the girls. She placed her hands gently on their shoulders. Her face was worn but kind, her eyes serious. "I'm sorry to interrupt your evening, Mr. White," she said. "I'm Linda. I'm their nanny." Alexander's stare didn't move from the girls. His voice, when he spoke, was low. "What is this?" Linda's hands tightened slightly on the girl's shoulders. "I know this is a shock, but if you'd be willing, I think we need to talk." He wanted to say no, to dismiss it, to stand and walk away and leave behind this confusion that was spiraling out of his control. But his instincts, the same instincts that had made him ruthless and successful in the boardroom, told him something else. He had faced deals worth billions, negotiations that had turned hostile. And yet this moment, right here, with two little girls staring at him like he was their entire world, made him feel completely unprepared. He exhaled slowly, releasing his grip on the wine glass. "Sit down," he said, his voice hoarse. "Talk." Linda nodded and gently guided the girls into the chairs opposite him. They sat quietly, their small hands resting in their laps, watching him with such innocence that he felt his composure fray. Linda took the seat next to them, her gaze steady. "I know this doesn't make sense," she began. "But I promised their mother I would find you." He stiffened. His breath slowed. "Dear mother." "Catherine Brooks," Linda said quietly. The name hit him like a hammer. He felt his body lock, his mind scrambling. Catherine. 8 years ago, she had vanished from his life. One day she was there, laughing, brilliant, alive. And the next, she was gone. He had searched for her, hunted through every connection he had. And she had simply disappeared. He had convinced himself that she had wanted it that way, that she had left because she was done with him. And now, here were these girls, with her eyes. "That's not possible," he said. But his voice lacked conviction. He stared at the twins, his mind cataloging every feature, the curve of their mouths, the shape of their cheekbones, the soft waves of blonde hair. "I'm sorry," Linda said gently. "But it is." He could feel the walls closing in around him. "She never told me. She didn't want to," Linda said. "She found out she was pregnant right when you were building your company. She thought if she told you, you'd feel obligated. She didn't want to be the reason you gave up your dream." Anger and grief collided inside him. That wasn't her decision to make. "I agree," Linda said quietly. "But it's what she chose." He clenched his jaw, struggling to breathe past the tightness in his chest. "Vera is she?" Linda's expression shifted, the sadness deepening in her eyes. "She passed away 6 months ago, Chancer." The word didn't need to be spoken aloud. He felt it like a blow to the chest. He closed his eyes briefly. She had been gone for half a year, and he hadn't known. He opened his eyes and looked at them again. These girls, his daughters, they had lost her, and now they were here. One of them spoke again, the quieter one this time. "Are you mad at us?" The question made his heart ache. He shook his head slowly. "No, I'm not mad." The braver one smiled faintly. "Mommy said you were busy, but you were nice." He let out a slow breath. He wasn't sure if he was nice. He didn't know what he was. But right now, he was the only thing they had left. Linda's voice was soft. "They just needed to find you." He ran a hand over his face. He wasn't sure he could do this. But he knew one thing. He wouldn't walk away. Will Alexander stared at the ceiling that night, the city skyline a blur beyond the glass windows of his penthouse. The lights of New York flickered in distant patterns, but none of it registered. Not the millions of dollars flowing through his investments, not the meetings waiting for him tomorrow, not the world he had so carefully crafted around discipline and control. His world had changed in an instant, and it had nothing to do with power or profit. It was 2 little girls asleep in the next room, and the fact that for the first time in his life, something mattered more than winning. He lay there, awake, long after he should have fallen asleep. His mind couldn't shut off. He kept hearing their voices. One calling him daddy like it was the most natural thing in the world, the other asking if he was mad at them with eyes so wide it broke something in him. He had spent his entire life avoiding messes like this. Emotions, attachments, unpredictability, he didn't have room for them. They made things complicated. But now the complication was sitting in his guest room, sleeping with their small hands clutching stuffed animals Linda had picked up on the way home. When he finally did sleep, it was restless. And when he woke, the first thing he did was listen. Silence. His penthouse was always silent, but this time it wasn't the usual stillness, it was anticipation. He got up, pulling a sweatshirt over his head as he padded barefoot down the hallway. He paused outside the door, his hand resting on the knob, not sure if he was ready for what was on the other side. Then he pushed it open. They were still sleeping. Sophia was curled up tightly, her hair spread across the pillow, her face relaxed. Lily had her arm draped over the stuffed bear, hugging it close. Something twisted in his chest. They looked so small, so fragile, and they were his. He backed out quietly, closing the door with care. In the kitchen, he made coffee, going through the motions he'd repeated for years. But nothing about it felt routine. His mind was 1,000 miles away when he heard the soft shuffle of feet. He turned, mug in hand, to find Lily standing there in the doorway, her hair messy from sleep and her feet bare against the cold floor. She didn't speak at first, just looked at him with quiet eyes. "Morning," he said, realizing how strange his voice sounded. "Morning," she whispered back, then hesitated. "Can I have something to drink?" He opened the fridge and cringed. He'd stocked this kitchen for himself. Bottled water. Protein drinks. Nothing a child would want. He grabbed a bottle of water and handed it to her, making a mental note to fix this. She took it carefully and climbed onto one of the stools at the counter, her small hands wrapping around the bottle like it was precious. He sat across from her, unsure what came next. Conversation wasn't something he excelled at, least of all with children, but she didn't seem to expect him to say anything. She just sat there, legs swinging slowly back and forth, drinking her water in silence. And for some reason, it felt less awkward than he thought it would. Sophie appeared a little later, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She blinked at them and climbed up next to Lily without a word, leaning on her sister for a moment before sitting up straighter. "I'm hungry," Sophia said. Alexander exhaled slowly. Breakfast. He could do breakfast. How hard could it be? He moved to the pantry, scanning the shelves. Then he checked the fridge again, annoyed at himself for not thinking ahead. There was no cereal. No milk they'd actually drink, no fruit. He sighed. Pancakes, he offered, realizing it was the only thing he could probably make without poisoning them. Sophia lit up. You can make pancakes. We'll find out, he said dryly. It wasn't pretty. He made a mess. The batter splattered. He swore under his breath a few times when he flipped one too soon. But when he set 2 plates in front of them, they didn't complain. Lily picked up her fork and took a bite like it was a 5-star meal. Sophia grinned through a mouthful of syrup. These are really good, Lily said, which made him almost laugh. They're pancakes, he said, but something inside him settled. After breakfast, they wandered into the living room. He realized, with a stab of guilt, that there was nothing here for them. His home was cold glass and polished steel, no softness, no color, nothing that said family. He stood there awkwardly as they explored quietly, their fingers brushing against expensive furniture and modern art they didn't understand. Linda showed up not long after, carrying a couple of shopping bags and a clipboard. She was practical, efficient, and unfazed by the transformation happening in his life. You need kid things, she said, as if it was obvious. I figured, he replied. She handed him a list. Toys, books, things he hadn't thought about in years. He stared at the paper, realizing he had no idea where to buy any of it. I can take care of it, Linda offered. He should have said yes. Delegating was what he did best. But he found himself shaking his head. I'll do it. Linda blinked in surprise but didn't argue. Later, they ended up in a store filled with too many bright colors and too many choices. He stood there, completely out of his element. As Lily clung to his hand and Sophia ran from shelf to shelf, picking up dolls and games and asking if they could have this or that, he told them yes to most things, not because he was spoiling them, though he probably was, but because he didn't know how to say no yet. Not to them. They returned to the penthouse with bags of toys, books, clothes they picked themselves, and a sense of something new hanging in the air. That night, after they had bathed and dressed in pajamas that actually fit, they sat on the couch watching a movie together. Alexander sat in the middle, their heads resting on his shoulders by the time the credits rolled. He realized, sitting there in the dim light, their soft breathing filling the silence, that this was the first time his home felt less like a museum and more like a place people lived in. When he finally carried them to bed, one after the other, and pulled the blankets up to their chins, he paused at the doorway. Sophia's voice, half asleep, caught him again. Good night, Daddy. It wasn't something he thought he deserved, not yet, but he said it anyway. Good night. And this time, the silence didn't feel empty. Roar it out, he said quietly. Together, but Alexander woke early the next morning. The sun wasn't up yet, but he was already standing by the window, coffee cooling in his hand, watching the faint lights of the city begin to blink on one by one. New York was waking up, its heartbeat steady and predictable, unlike his own life, which felt like it had spun into something wild and unfamiliar overnight. Behind him, down the hallway, were 2 little girls who had no idea just how unprepared he was for this. And yet, for the first time, he wasn't trying to find an exit. He didn't hear them come into the room. But he felt it. A presence at his side, quiet but curious. He turned his head slightly and found Sophia standing there, dragging a blanket behind her, her eyes still sleepy. She didn't say anything. She just leaned against him, resting her head lightly against his arm, like it was the most natural thing in the world. He cleared his throat, glancing down at her. You're up early. She shrugged, her cheek pressing against his sleeve. I was cold. Without thinking, he set his coffee down and reached for her, scooping her up and settling her in his arms. She was warm and small and light. She made herself comfortable like she'd done it 100 times before. He stood there, holding her, staring out the window while the city woke up beneath them. It felt peaceful. A word he hadn't thought about in years. Lily appeared a few minutes later, dragging her bear with her, rubbing her eyes. When she saw him holding Sophia, she wandered over and simply reached up, as if waiting her turn. He huffed out a soft laugh and knelt, balancing Sophia on one knee and lifting Lily onto the other. Both of them settled there without a word, like this was how mornings had always begun. He stayed there until they both grew restless, and started asking about breakfast. They ate cereal that morning. He'd stocked up the day before, an entire shelf in the pantry now dedicated to things he never thought he'd need. Colorful boxes, the juice pouches, snack bars with cartoon characters on them. It was strange how quickly his life was being rewritten. Linda arrived later, offering to take them to a nearby park. Alexander almost said yes. He had emails waiting, phone calls to make. His assistant had already left 3 messages reminding him of the investors' meeting that afternoon. But when he saw the way Lily's face lit up at the idea of him coming too, the word no stuck in his throat. "I'll come," he said instead. And just like that, he found himself walking through Central Park with 2 little girls holding each of his hands, pointing out every squirrel and bird, as if they were discovering treasure. He watched them climb on the jungle gym, their laughter echoing off the trees. He stood back at first, hands in his pockets, but Sophia called for him to help her cross the monkey bars, and Lily wanted him to push her on the swing. Before long, he was running between them, out of breath in a suit jacket he hadn't bothered to take off. They stopped for ice cream from a street vendor. He hadn't had ice cream in years. He bought them each a cone and got one for himself, mostly because Sophia looked offended that he wasn't eating anything. They sat on a bench, sticky fingers, and chocolate smiles, and he realized that his phone hadn't rung once. Or maybe it had, and he hadn't cared enough to notice. Later, back at the penthouse, the girls sprawled on the living room rug with crayons and paper. They drew pictures of the park, of themselves on the swings, of a man who looked suspiciously like him wearing a tie and holding their hands. Alexander watched them quietly from the couch, sipping his second cup of coffee for the day, feeling something heavy and unfamiliar settle into his chest. He wasn't sure what to call it yet. Linda joined him after a while, her voice soft so the girls wouldn't hear. "They're adjusting." He nodded. "Faster than I am." She gave him a look. "You're doing better than you think." He wasn't sure he believed her, but he appreciated the effort. She stood and excused herself, saying she had errands to run, leaving him alone with the girls for the first time since they arrived. He stared at them for a long moment. Then he pushed himself off the couch and knelt beside them, picking up a crayon. Lily grinned and scooted closer. Sophia handed him a sheet of paper and told him to draw whatever he wanted. He hadn't drawn anything since he was a kid, but he did it anyway. A house. Stick figures. 2 little girls holding hands. It wasn't much, but when they both smiled and told him it was good, he believed them. That night, after dinner, which they insisted he make, despite the fact he could barely manage pasta, he tucked them in. He read them a story from one of the new books Linda had picked up, stumbling over the voices but getting through it. They giggled at his terrible impressions of the animals, but they didn't ask him to stop. As he turned out the light, Lily's small voice whispered, "Daddy." He paused in the doorway. "Yeah. Do you like having us here?" He didn't answer right away. He crossed the room, sat on the edge of her bed, and brushed a strand of hair off her face. "I didn't know I needed you here," he said honestly. "But now that you are, I can't imagine you not being here." She smiled sleepily, turning into her pillow. Sophia murmured something he couldn't quite catch, but he was pretty sure it was the same. Later, sitting by the window again, he realized something. His life hadn't been missing more business, more money, or more success. It had been missing them, and he wasn't about to let it slip through his fingers. Alexander found himself moving through a life that was no longer his own, but he didn't mind as much as he thought he would. His mornings were no longer quiet. They started with little feet padding across hardwood floors, sleepy voices asking if it was time for breakfast yet, and 2 small girls who seemed to fill every room with noise and color. And somehow, the silence he had once craved felt distant now, unnecessary. He was learning as he went, mostly through trial and error. Lily preferred her pancakes shaped like stars, while Sophia was perfectly content with circles as long as she had extra syrup. They both insisted on sitting on either side of him at breakfast, and if he got up to get more coffee, they counted to make sure he came back. His spotless penthouse was now cluttered with drawings taped to the walls and stray crayons under the couch cushions. There was a pink stuffed rabbit on the dining room table that Lily insisted had to sit there because it liked watching people eat. Alexander didn't understand all the rules, but he followed them anyway, and somewhere along the line, he realized he had started smiling more. It wasn't easy. There were still moments when he felt completely out of his depth, like when Sophia got a fever one night and he found himself pacing the floor, holding her in his arms as if he could will it away, or when Lily woke up crying from a nightmare, and refused to go back to sleep unless he stayed in the room. He sat on the floor that night, his back against the wall, watching them breathe softly in the dark until morning came. He didn't sleep much anymore, but he was starting to understand that he didn't need as much as he thought he did. One afternoon, Alexander cleared his schedule. No calls. No meetings. No emergencies. He took them to the library because Sophia had mentioned wanting more books, and Lily wanted to know why planets were round. They spent hours wandering the aisles, their voices hushed but excited. He sat on the floor between them as they flipped through picture books and whispered questions he wasn't always sure how to answer, but he tried anyway. Afterward, they stopped for lunch at a small diner. Sophia ordered grilled cheese and tomato soup. Lily asked for pancakes because they were served all day, and that made her happy. Alexander drank black coffee and watched them color on the placemats with broken crayons the waitress brought over. There was something grounding about it. Simple, uncomplicated. On the way home they walked instead of taking the car. Sophia held his left hand, Lily clung to his right. They pointed out dogs and bicycles, and street performers like they were seeing the world for the first time. And he realized he was seeing it that way too. They ended up at a toy store by accident, or maybe it was inevitable. He told them they could each pick one thing. It was a mistake, of course, because they spent nearly an hour debating the merits of dolls versus art kits versus toy rockets. But they chose eventually, and he bought both without thinking about the price tag. He didn't care. Their smiles were worth more than any number he had in his bank account. Later, at home, he watched them open their new toys with the same excitement he once reserved for closing multi-million-dollar deals. He found himself sitting cross-legged on the floor, while they showed him how to build something with tiny blocks that scattered everywhere. He wasn't good at it. They laughed at him. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he laughed with them. When Linda arrived the next morning, she found them at the dining room table. Sophia and Lily were cutting out shapes from construction paper while Alexander tried to tape them into something that resembled a lantern. He wasn't succeeding, but he didn't look annoyed, just focused. She smiled quietly and made herself a cup of tea, knowing better than to interrupt. That night, after dinner, Lily curled up on the couch beside him, her head on his shoulder, and handed him a picture she had drawn. It was him, holding both their hands, with what she called their forever house in the background. It wasn't his penthouse. It was something different, a real home, with a garden, and a swing set, and a dog. Alexander looked at it for a long time, tracing the crayon lines with his finger. He wasn't sure what to say. He wasn't even sure what he was feeling. But he folded the picture carefully and tucked it into his wallet, next to his most important cards. The things that once defined him were slowly being replaced, and he wasn't fighting it anymore. As the girls went to bed that night, Sophia asked him about their mother. They hadn't talked about Catherine much. He wasn't sure he was ready, but he saw the question in their eyes, and he knew he couldn't avoid it forever. She was kind, he said softly. She laughed a lot. She made the best pancakes. Sophia smiled at that. Lily asked if she had liked the stars because she liked stars. He nodded, telling them how Catherine used to make him lie on the grass and point out constellations he couldn't pronounce. How she believed that every person had a star that belonged to them. "Do you think she's a star now?" Lily asked quietly. He didn't hesitate. "I think she's the brightest one." They smiled at that, and it made something tighten in his chest. After he turned out the lights and closed the door, he stood there for a long moment, staring at the handle, wondering how he had gotten here, wondering how he had ever thought anything else mattered more than this. When he went back to his room, he picked up his phone. He scrolled past the emails and the messages marked urgent. He called his assistant instead. "Clear my schedule for the next week," he said. "No meetings, no travel." There was a pause. "Sir, you heard me." He hung up before she could ask questions, and for the first time in his life, he didn't care what anyone thought. He was done living a life built around numbers and deals. His priorities had shifted. The center of his world was no longer measured by profit margins or stock prices. It was sitting in the other room, asleep, dreaming under a nightlight shaped like the moon, and he wouldn't miss a second of it. The next few days settled into something that resembled a rhythm. Not quite routine, because every day was different, but familiar in a way Alexander hadn't expected. He found himself waking up earlier, listening for the soft shuffle of footsteps in the hall, The apartment no longer felt like a showroom, cold and polished. It was lived in now, and every corner bore the evidence of that. Colored pencils left on the coffee table, tiny shoes by the door, stuffed animals occupying spaces that once held expensive sculptures. Alexander caught himself smiling more, without even realizing it. On Friday afternoon, he left work early. That in itself was an event his staff whispered about. His meetings were rescheduled without protest, because by now, his team knew better than to ask questions. He didn't offer explanations. He didn't feel he had to. There was nothing in his office more important than what waited for him at home. When he arrived, Linda was finishing homework with the girls at the dining table. Sophia was carefully writing out words in neat letters, her brows furrowed in concentration. Lily was doodling along the side of her worksheet, half her attention on the assignment, and the other half on a sketch of a puppy. Alexander watched them for a moment, unnoticed, something warm settling in his chest. "How's it going?" he asked, setting his briefcase down. They both looked up, their faces lighting up the same way they always did when they saw him walk through the door. He wasn't used to anyone being that happy to see him, but he was getting used to it. "I finished," Sophia announced proudly, holding up her paper. Lily shrugged, almost. "My puppy needed spots." Alexander chuckled. "I think that's a fair reason." Linda smiled as she stood. "I'll let you take it from here." He nodded, grateful for her steady presence, but even more grateful for the time she quietly gave them to be together. Linda left with a promise to return the next morning, and then it was just him and the girls again. Later, they ate dinner together. He'd hired a chef part-time now, though he insisted on making their breakfast himself. Something about pancakes had become their thing, but dinner was always an adventure. Tonight it was spaghetti, and Lily managed to get sauce on her nose, which Sophia pointed out with gleeful laughter. Alexander handed her a napkin, smiling as she wiped it away. "You two make meals an adventure." "That's because we like having fun," Lily said, twirling her fork like a baton. Sophia nodded. "A mommy said food always tastes better when you're happy." He paused for a moment, thinking about Catherine. It had been weeks since he'd first learned about the girls, and not a day passed without some memory of her sneaking in. He wondered if she'd be proud of him. If she'd approve of the way he was stumbling through this new life. He hoped so. After dinner, the girls curled up on the couch with blankets, insisting he watch a movie with them. Something animated, full of singing animals and silly jokes. He sat there, one girl on each side, and let himself get pulled into it. Lila's head rested against his shoulder, Sophia's feet tucked under her blanket as she giggled at the screen. It was different from the life he knew. Slower. Messier. But he didn't miss what he'd had before. When the movie ended, Lily yawned dramatically and announced she was ready for bed. Sophia followed, and Alexander helped them brush their teeth, braid their hair, and pick out pajamas. It was a new routine, but he was learning it quickly. And there was something comforting about it. As he turned off the lights in their room, Sophia spoke up softly. "Daddy." He paused in the doorway. "Yeah." She hesitated for a moment. "Thank you for staying." The words hit him hard. He wasn't sure what to say at first. He'd never imagined they thought about it like that they still wondered if he might leave. His voice was steady when he answered. "I'm not going anywhere." The next morning, he took them to the museum. Sophia had mentioned it in passing during one of their breakfast conversations, and he'd filed it away. It was an easy choice, something simple that made them both excited. They walked through the exhibits hand in hand. Sophia wanted to see the dinosaurs. Lily was fascinated by the stars in the planetarium. Alexander found himself answering endless questions, some of which he didn't know the answers to. But he promised to look them up later. At lunch, they sat outside on a bench eating sandwiches. Sophia pointed at a bird hopping nearby and asked if they could get a pet someday. Lily chimed in that a puppy would be better than a bird, because birds couldn't cuddle. "We'll see," Alexander said, already knowing he'd probably end up saying yes. He just wanted them to feel like this place, this life, was theirs too. That night, back at the apartment, the girls fell asleep almost immediately. He sat in his office afterward, staring at a photo of them he'd taken at the museum. They were standing in front of a huge dinosaur skeleton, both smiling wide. They looked happy. And that was enough for him. He made another call that night, to his financial advisor. They discussed setting up trust funds, planning for schools, securing a future that was stable no matter what happened to him. He did it quietly, without fanfare. But he did it because it mattered now. When he hung up, he walked down the hall again, stopping outside their room. He listened to their quiet breathing, the occasional soft sigh as they shifted in sleep. He opened the door just enough to see them. Sophia curled under her blanket, Lily's stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm. For the first time in his life, Alexander realized what it meant to be needed, and for the first time, he wasn't afraid of it. He stepped back, closing the door gently behind him. His world had changed. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and he was exactly where he wanted to be. The following week brought something Alexander hadn't expected: peace. Not the cold, calculated quiet of his old life, but a softer, warmer kind. It was found in small moments. In Lily slipping her hand into his as they crossed the street. In Sophia sitting beside him on the couch, reading quietly as if she'd done it 100 times before. The apartment no longer felt like a fortress. It felt like something closer to a home. It wasn't always easy. There were days when he doubted himself. Times when the weight of responsibility pressed harder than he thought it would. Mornings when he woke up unsure of how to handle their tears, or nights when sleep refused to come because his mind was too full of what-ifs. But they were fewer now, replaced by something steadier, a sense of belonging. He found himself rearranging his schedule without hesitation. Meetings were shorter, calls were postponed, and he wasn't working late into the night anymore. No one dared question it. He was still Alexander White, but there was a shift in his priorities now. And people noticed. They respected it, even if they didn't understand. On Saturday morning, Sophia came into his room holding a piece of paper. "Daddy," she said, climbing onto the edge of his bed. "We made a list." He sat up, blinking the sleep from his eyes. "A list?" She nodded solemnly and handed it over. It was written in crayon, the letters large and uneven. At the top, it said, "Things we want to do with Daddy." He smiled before he even read it. "Okay," he said. "Let's see." The list wasn't complicated. Go to the zoo, bake cookies, build a fort in the living room, read stories in funny voices, play hide and seek. The simplest things, things he had never considered. But that clearly meant everything to them. "Why didn't you give this to me sooner?" he asked, ruffling Sophia's hair. She shrugged. "We weren't sure if you'd have time." He folded the paper carefully, tucking it into the drawer of his nightstand. "I'll always have time." And he meant it. That afternoon, they built the fort first. The living room became a maze of blankets and pillows, chairs turned sideways to hold up their makeshift ceiling. They brought flashlights inside, even though it was still daylight, and ate peanut butter sandwiches on the floor. Lily declared it the best picnic she'd ever had, and Sophia added that it was their new secret clubhouse. Alexander wasn't sure how long they stayed in there, but he found he didn't care about the time. Later, they baked cookies. The kitchen turned into a disaster zone. Flour everywhere, sticky batter on the counters, and 2 girls covered in chocolate chips. He showed them how to crack eggs without getting shell pieces in the mix, and Lily insisted she be the one to stir even though the bowl was almost too big for her to handle. Sophia took it seriously, lining the cookie dough perfectly on the tray, while Lily popped extra chips in her mouth when she thought no one was looking. When the cookies were finally done, they all sat on the couch with warm plates, watching a movie and eating their hard-earned treats. Alexander didn't say anything, but something inside him softened even more. He had closed multimillion-dollar deals that hadn't left him feeling half as successful as he did in that moment. That night, after they'd gone to bed, he found himself standing by the window with a glass of water, staring out over the city. It was different now, seeing the lights from this perspective. Not as a man chasing the next opportunity, but as a father making room for something that had always been missing. He thought about Catherine often, especially during these quiet moments. What she would think if she could see them now. Would she be proud of him? Would she believe he was capable of this? He hoped so. He wanted to believe he was. A few days later, Linda sat him down at the kitchen table while the girls were at school. She placed a stack of papers in front of him. "You need to think about schools," she said. "This year is fine, but after that, they need a plan." He had spent his career drafting plans, mapping out futures for companies and investments. But this was different. This was their future. He picked up the packet, flipping through it. Private schools, academies, places where their names would open doors he'd never even known existed when he was a boy. "We'll find the right one," he said, though part of him wondered how he would know. Linda smiled faintly. "You already are." After she left, He sat at the table longer than he needed to, staring at the school applications. The weight of parenthood settled deeper on his shoulders. But it wasn't the suffocating kind of weight he had expected, it was grounding, real. That weekend, he took them to the zoo. It was on the list. Sophia wanted to see the giraffes. Lily was set on the penguins. They walked for hours, stopping for ice cream and riding the little train that circled the park. He let them lead, following wherever they wanted to go. They laughed so much his cheeks hurt from smiling. When they got home, Lily fell asleep on the couch mid-sentence. A stuffed penguin clutched under one arm. Sophia helped him carry her to bed, whispering that she was glad they had found him. He tucked them in, lingering at the door longer than usual. That night, he sat down at his desk and wrote a letter. He wasn't sure why, but it felt like something he needed to do. Catherine, I don't know if I'll ever understand why you made the choices you did. I'm still angry sometimes, and I wish things had been different. But they're here now, and I'm trying. I'm learning how to be what they need. And I hope, wherever you are, you can see that. You gave me something I didn't know I wanted. I won't let them down, I promise. Alex, he folded the letter, placed it in his drawer, and turned off the light. It wasn't about the past anymore. It was about what came next. And for the first time, he was ready. Morning light streamed through the windows, casting a soft glow over Alexander's penthouse. Once, mornings like this were reserved for conference calls and black coffee. But today, he was standing in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, hair messy, flipping pancakes under Sophia's watchful gaze. She sat perched on the counter, reading the recipe with all the authority of a head chef. Lily, drawing at the table, reminded him not to mess it up this time. He chuckled, flipping a pancake with exaggerated focus. It landed perfectly, golden brown. Sophia gave an approving nod, and Lily smiled, already returning to her sketch. Years of closing $1,000,000 deals never felt like this. The stakes here mattered more than any boardroom ever had. Later that morning, they went to the park, a spontaneous trip that had never once factored into his meticulously planned life. Sophia flew a kite high into the sky while Lily collected leaves, her small fingers brushing over each one like they were treasures. Alexander jogged to keep up. Not out of duty but because he didn't want to miss a second. Lying in the grass after, Lily snuggled into his side while Sophia pointed out cloud shapes. Both girls fell asleep like that, their small bodies curled against him. He held still, memorizing the feeling. That night, after tucking them in, he sat at his desk. Not to work, but to flip through a photo album Linda had brought. Images of Catherine and the girls. A life he hadn't known about. His finger lingered on Catherine's smile. So much time lost. But now he had this chance, and he wouldn't waste it. He picked up his phone and called Mark, his old lawyer. I need a lawyer, he said. Personal or business? Mark asked. Personal, but within days the paperwork was filed, custody, guardianship, every legal measure taken to make sure Sophia and Lily knew they were home, and this time, no one was going to leave. The process wasn't easy. Intervaluations, questions he hadn't prepared for, but he showed up, he tried, and that counted for something. One afternoon, Sophia tugged at his sleeve in the kitchen. Daddy, are we staying here forever? He knelt down, meeting her gaze. Yes, forever, but she studied his face, then threw her arms around his neck. Good, I like it here. Lily, standing nearby, nodded. M2. As weeks passed, the penthouse changed. Toys in the living room, crayon drawings on the fridge. Alexander's life restructured itself around school runs, bedtime stories, and pancake breakfasts. His staff quickly learned not to schedule meetings after 7 p.m. That was story time. One rainy afternoon, he found Lily staring out the window, fogging the glass with her breath. What are you thinking about? He asked. She shrugged. I wish Mommy could see us. He placed an arm around her. M2. Would she be happy? Lily whispered. He thought for a long moment. I think she'd be proud. Of both of you. That night, they made hot chocolate and watched a movie. Sophia fell asleep against his side. Lily lasted longer, her head resting on his shoulder. Later, after carrying them to bed, he stood at their doorway, watching them sleep. The girls who had once been strangers were now his whole world. Back in his room, he opened the drawer where Catherine's letter was kept. He didn't need to read it anymore, every word lived in his memory. But it stayed there, a reminder of the journey they had taken. His life had changed in ways he never expected. He had found something more valuable than success or power. He had found home. And as he turned out the lights, he knew he was exactly where he was always meant to be.